"If you sign today, you will never own anything again," my lawyer whispered, his hand tightening gently around my wrist just seconds before I stepped into that conference room. And for a moment I simply stood there, staring at the closed door in front of me, listening to the faint murmur of voices on the other side. Voices I knew better than my own, my son Daniel's low, steady tone and Rachel's lighter voice layered with that careful sweetness she had perfected over the years. The kind that sounded like kindness to strangers but always felt like calculation to me. And I remember thinking how strange it was that after 68 years of living, after raising a child, after building a home piece by piece with my late husband, everything I had could now fit into a single moment, a single decision, the simple act of walking through that door or turning around and leaving. But I didn't move, not yet, because something in Thomas Green's voice wasn't fear, it wasn't panic, it was certainty, the kind that settles into your bones before your mind has time to catch up. And I slowly looked at him, really looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, at the way he held that folder just a little tighter than usual, and I realized he wasn't warning me about what might happen, he was telling me what would happen, and yet I still reached for the handle because part of me needed to see it for myself, needed to understand how it had gotten this far, how the little things I had ignored over the past year had somehow turned into this moment. Rachel offering to help organize my accounts after Daniel mentioned how complicated things must feel for me now. The way she started sitting closer during family dinners, asking gentle questions about documents, about passwords, about things I had never thought twice about before, and Daniel, my own son, who used to call me twice a week just to hear my voice, now barely meeting my eyes when I spoke, always distracted, always letting Rachel answer for him. And I told myself it was normal, that people change, that marriages shift priorities, that I was simply getting older and needed to adjust. But standing there outside that room with Thomas's words still echoing in my ears, I could feel those memories rearranging themselves into something sharper, something clearer, like pieces of a picture I had been too trusting to see. And still, I turned the handle slowly, deliberately, and stepped inside. And the first thing I noticed was how bright the room felt, sunlight pouring through the tall windows, reflecting off the polished table where Rachel sat with a neat stack of papers already arranged in front of her, her smile immediate and warm as she stood to greet me. "Margaret, we were just waiting for you," she said, her voice smooth, practiced, and Daniel rose beside her, offering a small nod that didn't quite reach his eyes. And for a moment everything looked exactly as it should, like a normal family meeting, like something harmless, routine, and I smiled back just enough, taking my seat without a word, placing my hands calmly in my lap, and I could feel Thomas behind me, just outside the room, waiting. But I didn't look back, because I already understood something something they hadn't planned for. I wasn't here to sign anything, I was here to see how far they were willing to go. "It is just a formality," Rachel said, sliding the first document toward me with both hands as if she were offering something delicate, something thoughtful. And I noticed how carefully she had arranged everything on the table, each page aligned, each pen placed within easy reach, the kind of detail that looks like care but feels like control when you look closely enough. And I did not reach for the pen right away. I simply let my fingers rest on the edge of the paper, tracing the smoothness of it while my eyes moved across the title at the top, the legal language dense and familiar in a distant way, words I had seen before but never needed to question. And Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice softer than usual. "Mom, this will make things easier for everyone, especially you." And I could hear the effort in his tone, the way he was trying to sound reassuring without fully committing to the words, and I nodded slowly, not agreeing, just acknowledging that I had heard him, because I wanted them to keep talking, to fill the silence with their version of the truth. And Rachel smiled again, that same polished expression. "We have been reviewing everything over the past few months, making sure your assets are protected and managed efficiently. You should not have to worry about any of this anymore." And there it was again, that word worry, the one she used whenever she wanted to suggest that I was no longer capable, no longer sharp enough to handle my own life. And I lowered my gaze back to the paper, letting my eyes linger on a section that mentioned transfer of authority, the phrasing subtle but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. And I remembered the call from Thomas just 2 nights earlier, the way he had asked me to come in quietly, without telling anyone, his office dim and still as he spread out copies of documents that looked almost identical to the ones in front of me now, except for the dates, the signatures, the small adjustments that shifted everything without appearing to change anything at all. And I remembered how he had paused before speaking, as if weighing whether I was ready to hear it. "Margaret, these revisions were not filed through me, and they should have been," he had said, his voice careful, precise, And I had felt something settle inside me at that moment, not panic, not anger, just a quiet understanding that something had been moving around me without my knowledge. And now, sitting at that table, I could see it clearly, the way Rachel's hand hovered just slightly above the page as if guiding me toward it, the way Daniel avoided looking directly at the signature line. And I let a small breath out, almost a sigh, the kind that makes people think you are tired rather than thinking. And I picked up the pen, slowly, feeling its weight between my fingers, and Rachel's eyes brightened just a fraction, a flicker of anticipation she could not quite hide. And for a moment I held the pen above the paper, letting the silence stretch, letting them believe that this was the moment they had been working toward. And then I lowered the pen just enough to touch the page without writing, pausing there as if I needed one more second, one more reassurance, and I looked up at Daniel, meeting his eyes fully for the first time since I had walked in. And I saw it then, not confidence, not even certainty, but something closer to discomfort. Something that told me he knew more than he was willing to say, and I gave him a small, almost gentle smile, the kind a mother gives when she is about to let something go. And I set the pen down carefully beside the document instead of signing. Before I do this, I said quietly, my voice steady and even, I would like to understand exactly what I am agreeing to. And Rachel's smile did not disappear, but it shifted, just slightly, tightening at the corners as if she had expected the question, but hoped she would not hear it. Of course, she replied smoothly, already reaching for another page, already prepared with an explanation that sounded simple enough on the surface, but I could feel the room changing, the air growing heavier, the moment stretching in a different direction than they had planned, and I leaned back just a little in my chair, folding my hands together in my lap again, no longer reaching for anything, no longer following the path they had laid out because I already knew something they did not, and I was no longer in a hurry to show them. Rachel did not hesitate, she had been waiting for that question, and she turned the next page with a practiced motion, her finger landing precisely on a paragraph halfway down as if she had rehearsed this exact moment more than once. It is simply a reassignment of management authority, she said, her tone calm, almost soothing, the kind of voice people use when explaining something they expect you not to challenge. This allows Daniel and me to handle the day-to-day responsibilities, taxes, maintenance, investments, all the things that can become overwhelming. And I listened without interrupting, letting her words settle into the space between us, because the truth was not in what she was saying, it was in what she was not saying, and I glanced briefly at Daniel, who shifted slightly in his seat, his hand resting on the table but not quite touching the papers, as if he wanted to be part of the process but not fully responsible for it. And that small distance told me more than anything else, because Daniel had never been a man who stayed halfway in anything, not when he was younger, not when he used to stand in the kitchen with his father measuring lumber for a new bookshelf, not when he called me from college just to tell me he had passed an exam. He had always been direct, present, certain, and now he was none of those things, and I turned my attention back to Rachel, who continued speaking, explaining how this would simplify my life, how I would still benefit from everything, how nothing would really change except that I would not have to think about it anymore. And I let her talk, nodding once or twice at the right moments, giving her exactly what she expected, a quiet, aging woman who was relieved to have someone else take over. And as she spoke, my mind moved back again to that evening in Thomas's office, the soft hum of the overhead light, the faint scent of old paper and polished wood, the way he had placed two nearly identical documents side by side and pointed to the differences with the tip of his pen. Here, he had said. And here. Small changes, a clause added, a phrase removed. Authority shifted from one name to another, and I had felt a strange calm as I read through them, not because I was not concerned, but because I recognized something familiar, the same careful, incremental approach Rachel used in everything, never forcing anything all at once, always adjusting just enough that no single step seemed significant on its own. And now, sitting at that table, I could see the final step in front of me, the moment where all those small adjustments became permanent. And Rachel finished her explanation with a slight tilt of her head, her smile returning to its full brightness. So you see, Margaret, this is really for your peace of mind. And I let a small pause follow her words, just long enough to make her wonder if I had understood, just long enough to let the silence press against the edges of the room. And then I reached forward again, not for the pen this time, but for the document itself, lifting it carefully, bringing it closer to my face as if I needed to read it more clearly, and I traced the lines slowly, deliberately, my finger moving over the words that transferred decision-making authority, that limited access, that redefined ownership in ways that would be almost impossible to reverse once signed, and I nodded slightly, as if something was finally making sense. And this takes effect immediately? I asked, my voice still soft, still measured, and Rachel did not hesitate. Yes, as soon as it is signed and filed, she said, and I could hear the confidence in her answer, the certainty that everything was already in place, and I lowered the paper just enough to look at her again, really look at her, at the way she held herself, at the expectation in her eyes, and I wondered briefly how long she had been planning this, how many conversations had happened without me, how many decisions had already been made, and then I placed the document back on the table, aligning it carefully with the others, mirroring her precision, and I folded my hands again, resting them lightly in front of me, no longer reaching, no longer hesitating, just still, completely still, and I let another quiet moment pass before speaking. I appreciate the effort you have both put into this, I said, and Daniel looked up quickly, as if he had been waiting for approval, for agreement, for something that would make this easier, and Rachel's smile widened just slightly, but I did not continue in the way they expected. I did not reach for the pen, I did not lean forward, instead I leaned back just a fraction more, creating a small but undeniable distance between myself and the papers, and I added, just as calmly as before, but I do not sign anything I have not reviewed with my own counsel. And the shift in the room was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, like a current changing direction beneath still water, and for the first time since I had walked in, Rachel's expression faltered just for a second, just long enough for me to see it. And I realized then that this moment was not the one they had planned, not anymore, because I had already stepped outside of it and I was no longer following their script. For a moment no one spoke, and the silence felt different now, no longer polite or expected but stretched thin, like something about to give, and Rachel's hand, which had been resting so confidently on the stack of documents, slowly pulled back, her fingers curling slightly as if she needed to steady herself, and Daniel cleared his throat, the sound small but sharp in the quiet room. Mom, there is no need to make this complicated, he said, his voice carrying a hint of frustration that he could not quite hide, and I turned my eyes to him, not sharply, not accusingly, just enough to remind him that I was listening, that I had heard every word he had said and every word he had not, and I offered him the same calm expression I had worn since I walked in, the one that gave nothing away, because I had learned something important over the past few days, something I should have remembered much earlier. Silence can be mistaken for weakness, but it can also be used as a kind of space, a place where other people reveal more than they intend, and Rachel leaned forward slightly, reclaiming her composure with practiced ease. Margaret, of course you can have your own attorney review everything, we would never suggest otherwise, she said smoothly, though the warmth in her voice now carried a faint edge, a tension that had not been there before. But these documents are time-sensitive, there are filing windows, deadlines, and delays could complicate matters. And there it was again, the gentle pressure, never direct, never forceful, always framed as concern, always presented as something done for my benefit, and I let my gaze drift back to the papers, not reading them this time, just observing them, the way they were positioned, the way they seemed to anchor the entire room, as if everything we were saying revolved around those pages, and I remembered another detail from Thomas's office, one I had almost overlooked at first, the timestamps, the sequence of filings that did not align, the way certain amendments appeared before the documents they were supposed to modify, small inconsistencies that would not matter to someone skimming quickly but stood out clearly when you slowed down and paid attention, and I felt a quiet certainty settle deeper within me, not the kind that demanded action, but the kind that allowed patience, and I folded my hands more comfortably, resting them against the edge of the table as I looked back up at Rachel. Deadlines can be adjusted, I said gently, my voice even, almost conversational, and Daniel shifted again, this time more noticeably, his chair making a soft sound against the floor, and I could see the tension building now, not in dramatic gestures or raised voices, but in the small movements, the quick glances between them, the way Rachel's smile did not quite return to its original ease, and she reached for one of the documents again, tapping lightly on a section as if to redirect the conversation. This portion here simply ensures continuity, she said, her tone slightly firmer now. It allows us to act quickly if anything urgent comes up, repairs, taxes, financial adjustments. And I nodded once, acknowledging her explanation because I did not need to challenge her words directly, not yet. The truth did not require confrontation in this moment, it only required time, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, creating just a bit more distance between myself and the table, and I let my eyes move slowly from the papers to Rachel, then to Daniel and finally to the door behind them, the same door I had walked through just minutes earlier, the one that now felt like a boundary between two versions of the same situation, the one they believed they were controlling and the one that was quietly shifting beyond their awareness, and I allowed a small, almost thoughtful pause before speaking again. "I understand what you are trying to do," I said, my tone still calm, still measured, and Daniel's eyes lifted quickly, searching my face for something, agreement perhaps or relief, but I did not give him either. I simply continued, "But understanding something does not mean I need to decide today." And that was when Rachel's composure slipped, not completely, not enough for anyone outside the room to notice, but enough for me to see it clearly, the brief tightening around her eyes, the slight delay before she responded. "Of course," she said, though this time the words sounded different, less certain, less controlled, and in that small shift I recognized something important, something that confirmed what Thomas had warned me about. This moment had been carefully planned, timed, arranged to move quickly, to prevent questions, to create a sense of urgency that would override caution, and by stepping outside of that timing, by slowing everything down, I had already disrupted more than they expected, and I rested my hands quietly in my lap once more, no longer engaging with the documents at all, letting them sit untouched between us, and I felt no need to rush, no need to explain further, because for the first time since I had entered the room, I was not reacting to their plan, I was allowing it to unfold on my terms, and they were beginning to realize it. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound heavier this time, as if he had been holding it in for longer than he realized, and he leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table, no longer pretending to stay distant from the papers. "Mom, we are just trying to help you," he said, and there was something different in his voice now, not just frustration, but a kind of urgency that had not been there before, the kind that comes when a plan begins to slip, and I watched him carefully, noticing how his eyes moved briefly toward Rachel before returning to me, a silent check, a shared understanding passing between them that I was not meant to see but could not miss, and Rachel followed his lead, her tone softening again, though the control in it felt tighter, more deliberate. "You have always taken care of everything, Margaret," she said. "And no one is questioning that, but things change, circumstances change, and it makes sense to prepare for the future." And I let her words settle, not reacting to them immediately, because I had learned that the space between statements often revealed more than the statements themselves, and I reached for the edge of the table, resting my fingertips lightly against the polished surface, grounding myself in the moment, not because I felt uncertain, but because I wanted to remain exactly where I was, present, steady, unmoved, and I allowed my gaze to drift once more over the documents, not reading, not analyzing, simply observing them as objects, as tools placed carefully in front of me, and I thought about how many times I had trusted without question, how many times I had signed papers over the years with the quiet confidence that the people beside me were acting in my best interest, and I felt no bitterness as I considered it, only clarity, the kind that arrives too late to change the past but just in time to shape what comes next, and I lifted my eyes back to Rachel, meeting her gaze directly. "Preparing for the future is important," I said, my voice even, almost reflective, and for a brief moment, she seemed to relax, as if she believed I was moving closer to agreement, but I did not continue in that direction. Instead I added, "Which is exactly why I take my time with decisions that cannot be undone," and the shift in her expression was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, a tightening, a recalculation, and Daniel's posture changed as well, his shoulders drawing slightly inward, his confidence no longer as steady as it had been when I first entered the room, and I let the silence return. Again, letting it expand just enough to make them feel it, to make them sit in it, because silence, when used carefully, can become its own kind of statement, and after a moment Rachel spoke again, this time more directly. "If there is something you are unsure about, we can clarify it right now," she said, and there was a slight edge beneath her words now, a hint of insistence that had not been there before, and I nodded slowly, acknowledging her offer without accepting it. "I am not unsure," I replied, my tone calm, almost gentle, and Daniel looked up quickly at that, his expression searching, perhaps hoping for reassurance, perhaps bracing for something else, and I continued, "I am simply aware that there are details I have not yet reviewed in full," and I let that statement sit between us because it was true, but not in the way they might think, and Rachel's fingers tapped lightly against the table, a small, controlled movement that betrayed more than her words did, and she glanced at Daniel again, a quicker look this time, less subtle, more urgent, And I realized then that they had expected resistance, but not this kind, not the quiet, measured kind that did not give them anything to push against. And I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing myself a small, composed breath, and I thought again of Thomas standing just outside the room, waiting, not intervening, not interrupting, because he understood as well as I did that this moment needed to unfold, needed to reveal itself fully before anything else could happen, and I rested my hands calmly in my lap once more, no longer engaging with the table or the documents at all, and I spoke again softly, clearly, "I will take these documents with me." And that was when the tension in the room became unmistakable, not loud, not dramatic, but present in every small movement, every glance, every breath, and Rachel's smile returned, but this time it was thinner, more controlled. "That is not how this process usually works," she said carefully, and I met her gaze without hesitation, without raising my voice, without changing my expression. "Then perhaps this process needs to be adjusted," I replied, and in that moment I understood something with complete certainty. This was no longer about the documents on the table, it was about control, about who held it, who assumed it, and who was willing to let it go. And I had already made my decision not to sign, not to argue, but to remain exactly where I was, steady, patient, and entirely beyond the reach of the urgency they had created. The word adjusted seemed to linger in the air longer than anything else I had said, and I watched as Rachel's expression held for just a fraction too long before she responded, as if she needed to decide which version of herself to present next, the patient one or the firm one. And when she finally spoke, her tone carried both, carefully balanced. "Margaret, we are only trying to make this as smooth as possible for you," she said. But there was a new sharpness beneath the surface now, a quiet insistence that had not been there when I first sat down, and Daniel shifted beside her again, this time leaning back slightly as if creating distance from the conversation even while remaining part of it, and I noticed how his hands moved, clasping together, then separating, small restless motions that told me more than his words ever could, and I let my gaze settle on him for a moment, not to challenge, not to accuse, but simply to acknowledge that he was there, that I saw him fully, and then I turned back to Rachel because this was not his plan, not entirely, it never had been, and I understood that now with a clarity that felt almost quiet, almost settled, and I allowed a small pause before speaking again, just enough to remind them that I was not being rushed, that I was not following the pace they had set. "Smooth does not always mean safe," I said gently, and I could see the words land, not dramatically, not with shock, but with a subtle shift, like something aligning in a way they had not expected, and Rachel's fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the document stack, holding it in place as if it might move without her, and she leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering just a touch. "There is nothing unsafe about this," she replied, and I nodded once, acknowledging her confidence without agreeing to it, because I had learned that agreement was not always spoken. Sometimes it was assumed, and assumptions could be more powerful than words if left unchallenged, and I was no longer willing to let anything be assumed on my behalf, and I reached forward again, not for the pen, not to sign, but to straighten one of the pages that had shifted slightly out of alignment, my movement slow, deliberate, almost absent-minded. And yet I felt both of them watching it closely, as if even the smallest gesture might signal a decision, and that realization settled something deeper within me, a quiet understanding that this moment was no longer about persuasion, it was about anticipation, about waiting to see what I would do next, and I allowed my hand to rest lightly on the paper for a moment before pulling it back again, returning it to my lap, and I let the silence stretch once more, not as a pause, but as a space I was choosing to hold. And then I spoke, my voice steady, unhurried. "I will have my attorney review these." And this time I did not phrase it as a possibility or a preference. I stated it as a decision, simple and complete, and Rachel's response came more quickly now, the practiced calm still present but less effortless. "We can certainly coordinate with your attorney," she said, though the word coordinate carried a weight that suggested control rather than cooperation, and I met her gaze evenly. "That will not be necessary," I replied, and there was no edge in my voice, no confrontation, just clarity, and Daniel's eyes moved between us again, more openly now, as if he were trying to follow a conversation that had shifted beyond what he expected, and I could see the uncertainty there, the hesitation, and for a moment I felt something softer toward him, not forgiveness, not quite, but recognition, the understanding that he had stepped into something he did not fully understand, and I allowed that thought to pass without holding on to it, because this was not the moment for reflection, this was the moment for presence, And I sat there quietly, my hands still, my posture relaxed, giving them nothing to push against, nothing to redirect, and Rachel's smile returned once more, though now it felt more like a structure than an expression, something maintained rather than felt. "Margaret, we have already invested significant time into preparing this," she said, and there it was. Again the appeal to effort, to obligation, to the idea that because something had been done, it must be accepted, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her statement. "I am aware," I said softly, and I let that be enough because awareness did not require agreement, and I could feel the balance of the room shifting again, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, like weight moving from one side to another, and I knew then that whatever they had planned for this meeting, whatever outcome they had expected when I walked through that door, was no longer within their reach, not because I had opposed them directly, not because I had argued or resisted in any obvious way, but because I had simply refused to move at their pace, and in doing so I had stepped outside of the structure they had created, and there was a quiet power in that, one that did not need to be announced or defended, one that simply existed, steady and unshaken. And I remained exactly where I was, letting that power settle into the space between us as they began, slowly, to understand that this was no longer their moment to control. The room grew quieter after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that could be said without changing the outcome had already been spoken, and I could feel it in the way Rachel sat back slightly, her posture still composed but no longer leaning forward with the same quiet control, and Daniel's eyes moved again, this time not between us but down toward the table, toward the papers that now seemed to hold less power than they had just minutes ago, and I let the silence remain, not filling it, not softening it, because I had learned that silence, when held long enough, begins to speak on its own, and it tells the truth people are trying to avoid, and Rachel was the first to break it, her voice measured, though now carrying a faint trace of strain beneath its surface. "We were hoping to finalize this today," she said, and the word hoping lingered in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if she were trying to frame the situation as something reasonable, something expected, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her statement without offering anything in return. Because I understood what she was doing. She was shifting from explanation to expectation, from suggestion to subtle pressure, and I was no longer within reach of either, and Daniel finally spoke again, his voice quieter this time, less certain. "It would just make things easier moving forward," he said, and I turned my eyes to him, studying his face for a moment, noticing how his expression had changed, the confidence that had been there earlier now replaced with something closer to unease, and I wondered briefly how much he had been told, how much he had chosen not to question, and I felt a calm settle deeper within me, not the kind that comes from resolution, but the kind that comes from clarity, from seeing something exactly as it is without needing to reshape it into something more comfortable, and I allowed a small breath to pass before I spoke, my voice steady, unhurried. "Easier for whom?" I asked, and I did not raise my tone, I did not sharpen the words, I simply let them rest where they were, and that was enough because the question itself shifted the balance of the conversation in a way neither of them had anticipated, and Rachel's expression held for a moment, her composure intact but no longer effortless, and Daniel looked up quickly, his gaze meeting mine with a flicker of something that might have been realization, or perhaps just discomfort at being asked something he had not prepared to answer, and neither of them responded immediately, and in that pause I felt something settle completely into place, something that had been forming since before I entered the room, and I leaned back slightly, not retreating but creating space, the kind of space that allows things to unfold without interference, and I folded my hands together again, resting them lightly in my lap, and I let the silence stretch just a little longer because I knew now that there was nothing they could say that would return this moment to what they had intended, and Rachel finally spoke, her tone carefully controlled. "For all of us," she said, and I nodded once, acknowledging the answer without accepting it, because it was not an answer, not really, it was a redirection, and I had no interest in following it, and I allowed my gaze to move slowly from her to Daniel and then back again, not searching, not questioning, simply observing, and I realized then that the conversation had reached its natural end, not because we had agreed, but because the path they had laid out had been quietly closed, and I shifted slightly in my chair, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but enough to signal that I was no longer engaged in the way they expected, and I spoke again, my voice calm, clear. "I think we are done here for today," and there was no hesitation in the words, no uncertainty, just a simple statement of fact, and Rachel's smile flickered again, thinner now, more controlled. Margaret, perhaps we should revisit this before any decisions are made, she said, and I met her gaze evenly. That is exactly what I intend to do, I replied, and I allowed a brief pause before adding, on my terms. And the words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not forceful but unmistakable, and Daniel exhaled softly, leaning back in his chair as if releasing something he had been holding on to, and Rachel's hands remained still on the table, no longer adjusting the papers, no longer guiding the conversation, and I rose slowly from my seat, not abruptly, not with any sense of urgency, just a steady, deliberate movement that marked the end of something they had believed was already decided. And I did not reach for the documents, I did not take anything with me because I did not need to. Everything I needed was already understood. And as I turned toward the door, I felt the weight of their attention behind me, the unspoken questions, the recalculations, the realization that this had not gone the way they expected. And I paused for just a moment with my hand on the handle, not to look back, not to say anything more, but simply to let that moment exist exactly as it was, and then I opened the door and stepped out, leaving behind not just the room, but the version of events they had planned within it. Thomas was standing exactly where I expected him to be, just a few steps down the hallway, his posture calm, his expression steady, as if nothing about the past 15 minutes had surprised him, and I closed the door gently behind me, not rushing, not lingering, simply letting it settle into place before I turned toward him, and for a moment neither of us spoke, because there was no need to fill the space with unnecessary words. And he gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledges understanding, without asking for explanation, and I returned it just as quietly, and we began walking down the corridor side by side, our footsteps soft against the carpet, the air cooler here, removed from the tension of the room I had just left, and I felt something shift within me as we moved, not relief exactly, but a kind of alignment, as if everything that had been uncertain before was now settling into place, and after a few steps Thomas spoke, his voice low and measured. You handled that exactly as you needed to, he said, and I glanced at him briefly, not with pride, not with hesitation, simply acknowledging that he had seen what had happened without needing it explained, and I allowed a small breath to pass before responding. They were not expecting me to slow things down, I said, and he nodded once, his expression thoughtful. No, they were not, he replied, and there was something in the way he said it that confirmed what I already knew. This had been designed to move quickly, to leave no room for questions, no space for hesitation, and by stepping outside of that pace, I had already changed the outcome, and we reached his office, the familiar door opening into the quiet space I had sat in just days before, and I stepped inside, taking in the same details, the polished desk, the neatly arranged files, the faint scent of paper and wood, and I moved toward the chair across from him, sitting down with the same calm deliberation I had carried with me since the meeting began. And Thomas closed the door behind us before taking his seat, placing a folder on the desk between us, and this time there was no hesitation, no need for careful introduction. He opened it immediately, turning it toward me, and I looked down at the documents inside, recognizing them instantly, the same structure, the same language, but with the differences now fully visible, clearly marked, clearly understood, and he tapped lightly on one section. These are the versions they intended for you to sign, he said. And then he moved his hand to another page. And these are the originals. And I studied the two side by side, not rushing, not skimming, but reading each line with a clarity that had not been there before, because now I knew exactly what I was looking for. And I could see it all, the shifts in authority, the limitations placed on access, the way control was transferred in language that appeared harmless unless you understood its implications. And I felt no shock as I read, no anger rising. Just a quiet confirmation of what I had already sensed, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing the information to settle, and Thomas watched me carefully, not interrupting, not guiding, simply waiting, and after a moment I spoke, my voice steady. They were not just preparing for the future, I said, and he nodded once. No, he replied. They were preparing to take control of it, and I let those words settle between us, not as a revelation but as a statement of fact, and I folded my hands together again, resting them lightly in my lap, the same position I had held in the meeting, the same stillness, the same control, and I looked back down at the documents one more time, not searching for anything new, just confirming what was already clear, and then I lifted my gaze to Thomas, meeting his eyes directly. What happens next? I asked, and he did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because he understood the weight of the question, the shift it represented, and after a brief pause he spoke, his voice calm, precise. "That depends on how far you want to take this," he said, and I considered that for a moment, not in terms of action or reaction but in terms of intention, because this was not about retaliation, it was not about proving anything to them, it was about ensuring that what had been built over a lifetime was not quietly taken away through assumptions and silence, and I allowed a small, steady breath before responding. "I want everything to be exactly where it belongs," I said, and he nodded once more, a subtle acknowledgement that required no further explanation. And as I sat there in that quiet office with the documents laid out clearly in front of me, I realized that the moment in that conference room had not been the turning point. It had simply been the beginning. And what came next would not be rushed, it would not be reactive, it would be deliberate, measured, and entirely on my terms. The room felt quieter after that, not because there was nothing left to discuss, but because everything that mattered had already been placed on the table, and I sat there for a moment longer, looking at the documents in front of me, not as something threatening, not as something urgent, but simply as something that needed to be handled with care, and Thomas remained still across from me, giving me the space to arrive at my own conclusion without pressing, without guiding, because he understood that this was not about information anymore, it was about decision, and I let my eyes move once more across the marked pages, the clean lines of text that had nearly rewritten the structure of everything I had built over decades, and I thought about how easily it could have happened, how simple it would have been to sign, to trust, to move forward without question, and I felt no anger as I considered it, only a quiet recognition of how close I had come to losing something I had never imagined could be taken so quietly, and I placed my hand gently over the documents, not gripping them, not claiming them, just resting there for a moment as if to acknowledge their weight, and then I withdrew my hand and looked back at Thomas, my voice steady. "We secure everything first," I said, and he nodded immediately, as if he had been expecting those exact words, and he reached for another folder, opening it with the same measured precision, revealing a series of documents already prepared. Protective measures, reversals, confirmations of ownership, each one structured to reinforce what had always been mine, and I studied them carefully, not rushing, not skimming, but understanding each line fully, because this time there would be no assumptions, no unspoken trust, only clarity, and Thomas explained each step quietly, outlining how access would be restricted, how authority would be reaffirmed, how any unauthorized changes would be formally challenged and corrected, and I listened without interruption, letting the process unfold in a way that felt deliberate and controlled, and when he finished I nodded once, signaling that I understood, and I picked up the pen, the same simple object that had sat untouched in the other room, and this time there was no hesitation, no pause, because I knew exactly what I was signing, and I placed my signature carefully on each page, one after another, each movement steady, each decision fully my own, and when I was done I set the pen down gently, not with finality, but with quiet certainty, and Thomas gathered the documents, organizing them with practiced efficiency, and as he did he spoke, his tone calm but firm. "Once these are filed, any attempt to alter or transfer your assets without your direct authorization will be legally blocked." And I nodded again, not because I needed reassurance, but because I understood the significance of what had just been set in motion, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing a small breath to pass, and for the first time since I had entered that conference room earlier, I felt something close to stillness, not relief, not satisfaction, but stability, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand and what you have chosen, and I rose slowly from my seat, not in a hurry, not with any sense of urgency, just a natural movement that marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another, and Thomas stood as well, offering a small nod as he moved to open the door, and I stepped into the hallway once more, the same corridor I had walked through earlier, but it felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because I had, and as I walked toward the exit, I thought briefly of the room I had left behind, of Rachel's controlled smile, of Daniel's uncertain gaze, of the papers still lying untouched on the table, waiting for a signature that would never come, and I did not feel the need to return, not to explain, not to confront, because everything that needed to be said had already been understood, and as I reached the door and stepped outside into the afternoon light, I felt the quiet certainty settle fully into place, the kind that does not demand attention, does not announce itself, but remains steady beneath everything else, and I realized then that this had never been about stopping them, it had been about standing still long enough to see clearly, and choosing finally not to move in the direction they had planned.